Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a huge issue for any country that imports food. How do you keep prices stable when the world market goes completely haywire? Well, some new research gives us a surprisingly clear playbook.
Okay, so let's get right to the heart of it. For any country that relies on food imports, this is the fundamental question. When a crisis hits, whose job is it to make sure there's enough food and that people can still afford it? Do you leave it to private companies who are driven by profit? Or does a public agency need to step in with a mandate for food security?
To really get this right, you have to understand the two main players in the game. On one side, you've got your private commercial stocks. Think traders, millers, big retailers. Their goal is simple: make a profit. They buy low, sell high, and that naturally helps smooth out the small, predictable bumps in the market. But then you have public stocks. These are government reserves. Their goal is totally different. It's not about profit. It's about being a last resort buffer, a safety net for those huge out-of-the-blue shocks that the private market just can't or won't handle.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. We don't have to just guess about this. A real-world, natural experiment in the Philippines gives us some incredibly clear answers. We get to see how the world's largest rice importer handled two massive crises, using two completely different strategies. It's a perfect test case.
See, this isn't just theory. Back in 2019, the Philippines made a huge policy shift that created this perfect before and after scenario. It lets us compare side by side how a system with a strong public buffer held up versus a much leaner one when both were hit by the exact same kind of global shock.
So here's how it all played out. For years, up until 2018, the Philippines had this dual system. A public agency, the NFA, held big reserves right alongside the private sector. That whole setup got its first major test during the 2008 global food price crisis. Then, bam, 2019, a new law basically guts that public buffer. And just a few years later, that new, leaner policy faces its own trial by fire: India's 2023 rice export ban.
All right, so let's turn back the clock to 2008. This was one of the biggest food price shocks of the century. How did the Philippines' original system, the one with that strong public reserve, actually hold up?
Well, the data here just speaks for itself. It shows you the sheer power of that buffer. While global rice prices absolutely exploded, I mean a staggering 185% jump, the price hike for consumers in the Philippines was contained to just 64%. Now that's still a hit, for sure, but it was only about a third of the global shock.
So how on earth did they pull that off? The public agency, the NFA, was the key. As panic started to set in and private companies began selling off their stocks, the government stepped in and did the exact opposite. It went on an aggressive buying spree on the international market, more than doubling its public reserves to build a deep buffer against that global price storm.
And what's so crucial here is that they went into the crisis with a real safety net. The NFA was holding a public reserve equal to about 25 days of the entire country's consumption. That gave them the firepower they needed to intervene and shield their own consumers from the full force of the global price spike.
Okay, now let's fast forward to 2023. The new policy is in place, and that public safety net has been seriously weakened. Then, another global crisis hits. India, the world's biggest rice exporter, suddenly bans most of its exports. What do you think happens this time?
The result just couldn't be more different. When India's ban caused a 45% spike in global prices, that shock was transmitted almost one-for-one to consumers in the Philippines. They saw prices jump by 31%. There was almost no buffer. The international price hike went straight through to the local market.
So why was the buffer just gone? Well, the new law had completely tied the NFA's hands. Its budget was slashed and, most importantly, it was now only allowed to buy grain from local farmers. That meant it couldn't step in and buy on the world market when prices were low to build up a strategic reserve. It was essentially powerless before the shock even began.
The consequence of all this: a critically low public reserve. Instead of that 25-day supply they had back in 2008, the NFA was now facing a major global crisis with a buffer of less than 5 days of national consumption. The safety net was gone.
So if you're a policymaker and your job is to guarantee food security for your country, what are the clear, actionable lessons from this tale of two crises? What do you do?
The research frames this perfectly. The absolute best way to think about public food reserves is not as a cost, but as a national insurance policy. That's it. You pay a small, regular premium, which is the cost of maintaining the stock, to protect your citizens from a totally catastrophic financial event. Let's just look at the raw numbers of that trade-off.
On the one hand, yes, the new, leaner policy saved the government about 5 billion pesos, or around 87 million US dollars a year.
But the cost of that saving was a staggering 162 billion peso bill. That's $3 billion passed directly onto consumers in a single year. The premium for that insurance policy would have been a tiny, tiny fraction of the cost of the disaster.
So it all boils down to 3 really clear lessons. First, embrace a hybrid system. Let private companies handle the normal times, but you absolutely have to keep a public reserve for the big crises. Second, view that public stock as high-value insurance. A buffer of just 15 to 25 days of consumption can prevent a catastrophe. And third, and this one is crucial, align your stock and trade policies. The agency in charge of the buffer must be able to import when global prices are low to build its reserves cheaply and effectively.
At the end of the day, this analysis leaves every policymaker with one critical question. Private markets are great, they're efficient, but they are not designed to handle global panic. The next major food shock isn't a matter of if, but when. So, is your country's food supply properly insured?